Everyone. So we're really grateful that everyone's here today. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to join before we completely dive in. But before I get started, just a couple of little housekeeping things. We are recording this meeting just so that everyone knows. And so this is brought to you by South Florida Tech Hub. So I'll give a little bit of information about Tech Hub really soon. But what we will do is after the recording has been updated, then we will go ahead and put it on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to share this out or revisit it as well, because we are going to have really, really good conversation today. Murdoshi and I were just speaking with Jamie, and it's going to be really fun. You're going to get a lot of very great inside information that a lot of people aren't willing to share. So the way that the format will work after we get started here, you will be allowed to ask any questions along the way in the chat. So I'll be monitoring the chat as we go. And so feel free as questions come up to put them in there. And Jamie said that he is good for all questions are on the table. So it's going to be really fun and lively. But now that we've got given people a couple of minutes to join here, we'll just go ahead and kick off and get started. So my name's Ashton Adler. I'm with South Florida Tech Hub. And so what Tech Hub is, if you all are not familiar, we are a regional nonprofit, and we're the only tech agnostic organization in South Florida. So we represent Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County, and even up into the Treasure Coast. So our full mission is to continue to enhance the tech ecosystem here in South Florida. There's a lot of really exciting things that are going on. We are growing incredibly quickly. We have a strong presence just in general, and we're only continuing to grow further than that. So with Tech Hub, we have 4 different pillars. So one is talent. So I'm the director of talent engagement. And so one of the things we want to do is really to continue to enhance the talent pipeline. So K through 12 higher ed and boot camps, and we connect them to our member organizations. So we have over 175 member organizations ranging from everyone from City Furniture, Office Depot, FPL, all the way down to startups. So that's one of the things that's really great about Tech Hub is that we service all. We also really stay connected to the community. Also want to let people know that South Florida is not just beaches and palm trees, that we're so much more than that, and then entrepreneurship as well. So we have an amazing lunch and learn for you today. So Murdoshi is our chair of our policy committee. So Murdoshi LaFrance is really incredible. She will give you her background as well. And then of course we have our featured guest, Jamie Grant, with us today. And so Murdoshi, what I will do is I will hand it off to you, and then also to you again as a reminder for those that are with us, you can ask questions in the chat, and then also we will put sources and links in there as well. So without further ado, Murdoshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ashton, and thank you everyone for joining. I know there are a lot of folks that are going to come on in, but you'll see a lot of information in the chat. So whether that's the South Florida Tech Hub website or how to reach us, please feel free to engage with us. As Ashton said, my name is Murdoshi LaFrance, and I serve as the policy chair for the South Florida Tech Hub, and proud to do so. And we're very, very excited about the guest that we have today, Jamie Grant, who is not only CEO of Redleaf, but he's also the state's former chief information officer, and he also serves as the chair of the Associated Industries of Florida's AI Coalition. So before we dive in, Jamie, for those of folks on that don't know you, like, let us know who you are, and then we'll dive right into questions.
Yeah, it's great to be with y'all today, and love the mission, Murdoshi. Super excited for this conversation. I'm a third generation Floridian that just relocated to Greenville, South Carolina, but still in Florida pretty regularly, and Florida always have a special place in my heart. I'm a recovering lawyer. I have repented. I only practiced for about a year and a half. Co-founded a software company, and I think kind of to make a plug for both what y'all are doing and as an organization. When you were co-founding a software company in Tampa in 2010, we were told all the time, even as we were starting to go like kind of on the precipice of hyper growth, we were told all the time, like, you can't do that in Florida. We'll fund you if you move to the Valley. We'll fund you if you move to Austin. We'll fund you. And I think if I look kind of 15 years back along that journey, I think it's just amazing to see the amount of capital and talent and innovation that's happening in a state that has every asset necessary to own the future. There's
Right.
only one state in the country that has Corey Station in Pensacola. There's only one state in the country that has the Napa of the Americas. There's only one state in the country that has CENTCOM and SOCOM, and it just happens to be the same state, right? And so there's obviously a lot of challenges. We've had a pretty sordid past with state technology and trying to get it organized and trying to get it operationalized. But I think it's just a really cool opportunity for the state. And I think the work y'all are doing to help, especially startups, like,
Mhm.
we need those big players, but my heart will always be a startup guy that looks at people who are figuring out how to disrupt stuff. And co-founded a software company at the same time, was in the legislature. So I did a 10-year tour in the Florida House of Representatives, did a lot of tech policy work. And the combination of being kind of a software guy that was in the legislature led to the governor asking me in 2020 to go be the CIO for the state. And after saying hell no a few times, eventually kind of felt like, all right, I think it's kind of an obligatory thing. It's obviously a passion. It's something that I think has to get done. And so I did 3 of what I describe as kind of the most hellacious years of my life, just trying to build a startup from within government and navigate all of those challenges that are just so real. And made a lot of great progress with the team. I think if I looked back and said, what am I kind of most proud of? There's different data elements that were a lot of firsts in state history and even nationally. But the team we built was elite. We recruited from all over, and really were able to bring in people that didn't have government experience or didn't have tech experience, but had government experience. And I think in doing that, we were able to go pretty fast, in spite of some of the systemic challenges in Florida.
Oh, that's awesome. And, it's interesting because I know a lot of folks on here, especially those that follow Tech Hub, are founders, right? They are startup founders. So,
Yeah.
by definition, trailblazers, and we know that blazing trails is not easy. And so I can only imagine what your life was like. But let's go ahead and dive in. So, first question for you is, clearly you defined working, not only being a startup founder, but obviously also working for the state of Florida. As you work in both sectors, so public and private, if you had to give like a Florida tech policy one-on-one crash course,
Yeah.
what are the key pillars shaping the state's tech landscape right now, since obviously you have such experience in it?
Yeah, we like to call them stakeholder islands. I think the first thing anybody has to understand in a go-to-market, and if you're a
Yeah,
technology company that's trying to do business with government, you have to see government as a very unique vertical to do business with.
right,
And so you can have the greatest product in the world, you can have the most elite team in the world, but the public sector is kind of like this subset of this group of islands that all have different currencies, have different customs, have different regulations, speak a different language, have different incentive structures. And so I think the biggest thing I see across the country and Florida specifically is just the access to information and communication and knowing how to navigate those stakeholder islands. So you have the private sector islands, and even within that, like, I find most startup companies have no idea what a distributor does. They have no concept of what a VAR is and whether that VAR is a value added reseller or a jar that is just another reseller passing paper.
right.
How to navigate that world, what contract vehicles look like, what a lobbyist does, what they don't do, how to get the most out of their lobbyist.
Yeah,
So there's kind of like the private sector go-to-market element of public sector, and those islands are very distinct. Those islands speak very different languages. They have different incentive structures and different rules. And so I think to understand the public sector, you have to understand that side. And then
right.
I think the second thing that I would say to somebody that was looking to go to market in the public sector is quit thinking about government or Florida as if it's a monolith.
Ooh,
There are all sorts of islands within that, right? The legislature makes headlines, the governor's on national TV, but purchases happen at the agency level.
Right.
And so understanding the distinction between public policy, right? So when
Mhm.
you see the legislature as a board of directors that is passing governance,
Yeah.
they're very relevant. When you understand the tremendously powerful role in Florida that legislative staff plays.
Right.
One of the reasons I said when I took the job that if you took the 50 state CIO jobs and made the college coaching parallel, Florida has historically been one of the worst jobs in America.
Mm.
And understanding why is important. It might be as decentralized as any state. So some state CIOs have a very centralized structure where they have alignment, resources, all those things.
Right.
Florida is as decentralized as any other state. Number two, term limits. So you have very few legislators that actually understand the legislative process, the rules. One of the things that members would often say is, I'm terming out right as I learn how this place works.
Yeah.
And so, regardless of what people think of term limits, it absolutely creates a power vacuum that shifts it from the elected to the unelected, from the transparent to the background.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand why staff matters. And at the same time, I still do dinner when I'm in Tallahassee with my former staff directors of committees. Like there's some tremendous staff and the good ones are invaluable, but understanding the role they play. And then understanding kind of what a CIO does. I think that job is rapidly changing really
Yeah.
quickly, and people are either going to become a dinosaur or they're not, and they're going to adapt. But understanding all those different islands, and if I was to sum that up, Murdoshi, I think those islands are each critical. So any
Yeah.
one of them can stop you in your tracks.
Yeah.
Understanding how they all work and how to navigate them, I think, is the most important thing to access public sector specifically, and maybe to sum it for a founder. Understanding that the other side of the table probably has very little, if any, private sector experience,
Mhm.
executive experience,
Mhm.
oftentimes has never run a P&L,
Yep.
oftentimes has no idea what's driving commerce. And
Yep.
so level setting and saying like, hey guys, where are you in this journey on the discovery side? I think the biggest flaw I see over and over and over is that private sector companies trying to sell to the public sector have no ability to do effective discovery. And as a result, they're speaking different languages and this thing's just spinning.
Right. And they're not getting anywhere.
Nowhere.
No, I love that you like just as you described them, like all these islands, stakeholder islands, I think was a perfect way to describe them because as you stated, being in the private sector and doing business with government is very different. And I think if you haven't navigated both of those worlds, you're gonna spin your wheels, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the incredible work that you did as a CIO or former state CIO. So you launched Florida's first cybersecurity operations center. Obviously, with the rise of AI and growing cyber threats, what's the state doing to stay ahead in digital security and AI governance?
Um, a lot and nowhere near enough. And I say that, when I talked a little bit about the team we built, one of the mistakes I made on the legislative side before I became the state CIO was we wrote into statute a data catalog. I looked at it and said, we were really frustrated with what state technology was doing. I could get no answers,
Yeah.
even as a relatively senior or relevant member of the House. I would ask
Hmm.
questions, we'd get no answers, we'd get a PowerPoint deck, nobody could measure success,
Wow.
nobody had an API catalog. No, I mean, like it was insane.
Hmm.
And so we thought, let's write into statute and tell the state CIO they're going to deliver a data catalog. So we at least know what we have, where we keep it, what we call it, who owns it, all of those kind of fundamental questions.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate reality of how decentralized Florida is, you just quite frankly have a lot of agencies that don't want to participate, right? They don't want to have that kind of what they perceive as accountability rather than seeing data governance as a massive empowerment.
Right.
And then you have a legislature that doesn't understand that that dynamic is real.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at the state CIO going, how come I don't have a data catalog yet? And it's like everybody's just kind of pointing this way.
Hmm.
If I were to break down, what we need to be doing to even spell AI operations, data governance is the foundation. And
Right.
so the state's chief data officer, Ed Ryan, has done a beautiful job creating some coalitions. Warren Sponholtz, the state CIO is just a rock star. We recruited him from an agency. It was really important to try and get buy-in at kind of the central with Warren, Chandra McGlohan, a couple folks that had been agency CIOs to try and change the landscape. But I think if I said one of the biggest things I was frustrated in my inability to get done, it was the data catalog, because it's the framework for everything. And so AI is this massive accelerator. But if it's true, as I believe, that everything scales, you really can't leverage AI if you can't understand where your data is, who owns it, who has access, and those kind of things. So I think that's maybe the opportunity for the governor's office and the chambers to really kind of push and say, guys, we're going to get really serious about getting cooperation, because you can't do data governance. You can't do, I mean, you just can't do any of it if you haven't started at the data governance level. That said, like, I think the whole estate model we built in Florida, and it's been a challenge every year to get that funded because of just some of the misunderstandings and miscommunication.
Yeah.
But before our tenure, there were 0 state agencies that had collaborated in any technical or operational way in cybersecurity, just at the state level. By the time I left, our team had gotten that to 35.
Wow.
There were 0 state agency, 0 local entities that had collaborated. There had never been any sort of kind of whole of state or jurisdictionally agnostic cyber program. There's more than 200 today. And so, and we had, I think, about 334, if my number is accurate, from a few years ago that wanted to opt in, and there weren't enough funds. And so I think, just doing the communication work to explain why a marketplace of solutions, a federated model, and finally kind of looking at cybersecurity no differently than we look at water quality. Tallahassee and local government don't argue over whether our constituents didn't argue over whether water quality was a state or local issue. It was just an issue of, is there brown stuff coming out of my tap when I turn it on?
That part.
And I think the challenge with cyber is I think, if you don't see it and feel it, it's not real. And if the breach doesn't get disclosed, and if the ransom doesn't happen, if the impact isn't felt, it's not real.
Yeah.
And so I think we have a lot of folks that are just kind of going with like let's just defer. And I think that's probably my fear, is at some point that the really big impact happens. And then all of a sudden people go like, what are we doing? And it's like, man, the blueprint's there. The team's been there. They're trying to run it. And so maybe balancing it, Murdoshi. I think I could have done a much more effective job as a leader to better communicate. I told our team all the time, like, our communication sucks, and that starts with me. We need to go to every island and make sure they understand what's happening. But I think that's the major opportunity. The good news is, you have a Speaker of the House that created a brand new kind of super committee. South Florida boy, Danny Perez.
Oh, Danny.
Danny's
We're fans of Danny.
Danny is I wouldn't want to pick a fight with Danny, right? Like, he finishes the job. And so, he put out a memo that if your group hasn't seen, I'm happy to share, but he announced a new committee, because before this committee, there had never been a single committee in the legislature that dealt with both policy and budget. And in the absence of that, you could have all of these kind of shady and sketchy things go into what's called proviso, and nobody has to put their name on it. Sole source $20 million deals are happening, like really gross stuff that would be criminal if it wasn't government doing it. And so now Danny said, time out. We're going to have a committee that's going to see policy and budget come together. We're going to start reviewing a lot of these boondoggle projects. And we're going to start going after the grifts. And then you have a Senate president who said that getting this right is important. So I absolutely expect that this legislative session, there's going to be a pretty robust dialogue and back and forth between the two chambers. They probably have different versions or visions of what it should look like. But I think what's clear is that both chambers are really frustrated with the continued spend and these projects that continue going way over budget. Murdoshi, I'll land this one here because I could go on for days and I need to shut up.
No, you're fine.
The former budget appropriation staff director, Joanne Lesnoff, who's a saint and an absolute savage, when I got appointed, presented to the House, and she had pulled the numbers from 2005 to 2020, more than $500 million had been wasted on projects that either never went live or went way over budget.
What?
$500 million. And it's done in a broken procurement model. We keep doing it. We keep throwing good money after bad, and the taxpayers holding the bag. And so that's why we need this community. We need innovators that show up. We need to disrupt how the procurements are done, because it's very much an oligarchy of good old boys and insiders that don't want people to know how it works.
Yeah.
They get to set the price, they bill on time and materials. And at the end of the day, if we built the interstate and paid for it by the pound of asphalt, it would look like spaghetti, because the road builder would have 1,000 change orders to say, well, I'll build you a more straight line if. And that's what happens with these state technology projects. And I think whether it's Doge or the work that the legislature is doing or the governor's office is doing, people are going to start to see how gross that grift has been.
No, and I appreciate you saying that. So for the folks that are on the call, what Jamie is talking about in the legislature, so there's a policy substantive committee, and then there's appropriations, and they've never kind of been married. And so for those of you on the call who are like, what is he talking about? Those two things have never been married. There is a substantive committee. So for example, there's an education pre-K substantive committee, which deals with policy. And then there's an education pre-K appropriations committee, and the two are not the same. And so what Jamie is saying is that our incredible speaker, Danny Perez from South Florida, you guys can give him a shout out after this is done, is basically trying to marry the two, which makes a lot more sense. So as we talk about the legislature, Jamie, let's pivot a little bit to legislative updates. So obviously, in your mind, what major tech related policies should founders and tech leaders, all the folks, good folks on this call, should be tracking or keeping up with in the upcoming well, not upcoming, it's happening right now. So during the legislative session.
Yeah, I want to be careful how I answer this, Murdoshi, because I think kind of like if you're chasing an RFP, you're wasting your time.
Mm-hmm.
If you're one of the things I always tell people engaging in the legislative process, you're either at the table or you're on the menu.
Yeah.
So if you're not meaningfully engaged at the table, like understand your allocation of resources, understand that time is your most precious asset, and monitor, but don't spin out and don't waste time. Number one.
Right.
Number two, understand that 95% or more of what happens during the legislative session is kabuki theater. So what's happening in the open is wildly different than what is actually happening.
Yeah.
And so, I think when we talk about legislation that's out there to fundamentally change the way the state is organized from technology, that would be transformational stuff, and kind of what we always envisioned as year two of the policy work we were going to do in when I thought I was staying in the legislature. So I would say pay attention to it, don't stress it, don't sweat it. And then also find a friend that can translate. Understand that what you're reading might not be the thing. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day that leads a really relevant association, and they were going to be going to Tallahassee for some meetings. And they said, well, we want the state to do this. And this was really a how. And I said, here's what I would advise you. Go to that staff or go to those members and give them the what. We're concerned about what this is or is not. We're concerned that something is not happening or should be happening. Here's the why. We need your help to figure out the how.
Yeah.
And my work as a chairman, when I was having to oversee a silo of bills coming through, or my work with my own bills, that was one of my own rules, was I don't necessarily care about the how, as long as it was consistent with my principles. If we're going to agree on what the problem is, great. Now let's collaboratively solve it. And I think so many people show up in Tallahassee and say, here's the language I need you. And they don't understand the process. They don't understand the rules. They don't understand it. So just ignore the how. Pay attention to where it's going, and then find a friend to translate and say, hey, look, I think I can be helpful with this, or, hey, we have a solution to this, or that kind of thing. I think is really important.
No, I appreciate that. And I want to go back because you mentioned legislative staff. And I think, honestly, they're probably the most underappreciated group of people that I've ever met, staff directors and just analysts.
Yeah.
Super smart people who are amazing at what they do. And so I appreciate you saying that. Because for the folks that are here that are going to Tallahassee, whether your company has a lobbyist or you're using a collective or an association to lobby for you, legislative staff are gems. They really are. And so to Jamie's point, legislators are term limited. And so for the extent that they're there, they're not there for the entire duration, but you do have folks with institutional knowledge that are there, that are, legislative staff, committee chairs, except committee directors, and they can really be a resource for you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about balancing innovation-friendly policies, right? So, how is our state balancing innovation-friendly policies while addressing regulatory concerns, especially for emerging industries like AI, fintech, Bitcoin, etc.?
Yeah, man. One of the things that I think you've seen that's been really cool over the last 20 years in Florida,
Mhm.
the good news and the bad news. The good news is we've experienced so much growth that the
Mhm.
growth has funded the ability to not necessarily get deep and technical and figure out how to create efficiencies, right? So where other states are having people elect with their feet to leave,
Yeah,
and that tax revenue is causing real challenges for them, we've obviously created an environment, and I think COVID accelerated it, right? Where
it,
schools were open,
it
business
did.
was open.
It did.
Gosh, y'all are like the epicenter, right, of a mass migration
We
where
are.
people, right? And so that's great news, and
Yeah.
and it's a tremendous opportunity. At the same time, I think a lot of times, I told people when I ran for office, I'm not asking you to trust me to go to Tallahassee to solve all your problems. I'm
Hmm.
asking you to trust me to go to Tallahassee to prevent government from trying to stop all your problems.
Mm. Yeah.
And, Murdoshi, your question, I think, is really solid on a number of fronts, but like I get asked this question all the time on AI, like,
Yeah.
where's AI going to go? And it's like, tell me what the policy holders or what the policymakers are going to do, and then I'll
Yeah.
tell you.
Yeah.
The future of AI in the public sector is so much more
Hmm.
about what gets put on paper than what an LLM can do.
Yeah.
And so, yes, data privacy, data sovereignty, those are huge things. And
Yeah.
that's where the legislature should be playing and setting standards. I'm still the same, like borderline libertarian, distrustful of government guy as I was when I ran for office. Nothing's changed. So I think there's a few things. Price transparency.
Ooh, yeah.
Like, one of the things that this little oligarchy of good old boys and insiders are doing, if you actually follow how that $500 million got wasted,
Hmm.
here's the roadmap. Agency has legacy system.
Hmm.
Agency needs to reform legacy system.
Hmm.
Agency has nobody in the shop that knows how to scope, design, or price what that looks like.
Yeah.
Agency goes out to vendors to say, how much would it cost? Those systems integrators slap a tag on it and say it will cost this.
Hmm.
Agency goes to the Office of Policy and Budget and says, we need this to modernize that.
Yeah.
The Office of Policy and Budget has no concept. They
Right.
do now because there's a little bit of leadership there, but Chandra going in there was a huge help. But there was nobody in there that could understand any of it. And so the agency says, this is what we need. OPB says, okay, sounds like that's what it is. It either goes in the governor's recommended budget or it doesn't. And then it shows up as a procurement, an RFP, that agency who priced it and scoped, I mean, that SI that priced it and scoped it, then responds to.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a founder of an innovative company, if you're the manufacturer of something, you're now completely dependent on one of those SIs liking your technology or not. That
Right.
you're held hostage to whether they want to put it in that bid or not. The RFP process effectively makes a proof of concept. I don't want to say illegal, but it basically pushes it out because it sets the stage for a bid protest.
Right.
Um, so I think price and operational transparency. There's a cool blog kind of launching. I think it's floridaprocurements.com. I'll follow up with you, but Sean Gellis is kind of open sourcing, like, hey guys, here's how this stuff goes, and this is what this looks like. I think if you don't understand the roadmap of like the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, how an idea becomes a boondoggle is the exact same kind of thing to understand how it navigates.
Yeah.
And so I think we need price transparency. I
Yeah.
think we need a robust proof of concept marketplace. I
Mhm.
think we need to radically disrupt the status quo. And there's going to be some people that are going to fight it left and right because there's
First.
hundreds of millions of dollars on their P&L.
Right.
But as Doge is showing at the federal level, it's absolutely unsustainable. Follow the data, follow the dollar, and we can find efficiencies all over the place. Murdoshi, I'll give you another example just on licenses. So DOJ is doing this at the federal level to tell agencies, cut your IT spend 70%, and then they're going line by line.
Yeah.
Even under the exact same enterprise agreement for the same OEM manufacturer. So one enterprise agreement for the state of Florida, up to a 70% price differential for the same exact license in agency 1 and agency 2, just because they can. And so all of this stuff that's happening in the background that, you know, a person that's focused on product market fit and product velocity, how can we expect the innovation community to also become experts on that side? We can't. And so I just think it's really important that we have people who have been in the battles, who have had to fight that battle, and who can identify, to your point, there are some gems, and most staff are gems.
Yeah.
I also found staff members that were the greatest asset for the CCP in Kremlin and the biggest saboteur of innovation in Florida that could possibly exist. So, so how do we identify who those people are? How do we focus on truth and transparency to open source what it actually looks like? Because the truth will eventually eliminate those things. When taxpayers and constituents understand how much money is being wasted on boondoggles, they're going to demand change. And now the legislator that has to go home and answer to it is going to have questions. And now those gem of staff members can be put on a mission to go, hey, we need to change it. And we finally have the empowerment to change it. We've got some answers. What does it look like?
No, I love that. Just, and for everyone, obviously the theme here with Jamie is accountability, if y'all can hear it. Because I think, you know, not I think, but I know accountability would allow a lot of this stuff to be rectified. And so, you know, to your point, like if we did hold folks accountable and they really knew what they were doing, like would we still be in this place, right? Last question on legislative updates, Jamie. So you talked quite a bit about Florida's population. Ashton and I and Nikki and all the folks who live down here, not exactly enjoying all of the traffic we have to go through. But clearly our population is booming, still booming post-pandemic. And tech hubs are obviously growing rapidly, as is the South Florida Tech Hub. Are there legislative efforts to expand broadband? And obviously, I wouldn't be me if I wasn't asking about broadband. And also improving digital infrastructure and support on rural, you know, tech expansion, because obviously not all of the state of Florida is urban. So
no, I think it's a great question. So and kind of repeating theme, the decentralization. So the Department of Commerce does have a broadband office, as I know you're familiar with, but for the audience, I think that's going to be a fascinating issue to track. And the reason I say that is when we look at like this inversion. So we ran the largest Starlink deployment outside of Ukraine at the time in response to Hurricane Ian. We could have never laid fiber or broadband to respond, right? So I think there's this question of what does redundancy and reliability look like? To your point, reliability is my team's heard this ad nauseum. Reliability is the most important ability. I can trust your intentions and your ability. So there's no doubt that broadband plays a critical role, right, in our rural communities. I think there's a number of factors that are going to continue pushing, and I think y'all are, if you're not experiencing it, it's happening. When you look at like Lee County, just west of you on the other side of the state, they're seeing a lot of population kind of slowly. When you think about housing affordability, traffic, lots of reasons that people go, man, I just don't want to live in this congested place. So I think what I would stress is network access and network connectivity and reliability is kind of an all of the above approach. That I think we have a ton of opportunity in Florida to continue accelerating.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, let's move on to business startups and government engagement. We talked a little bit about it already. But I think one of the things that I heard you say just earlier was how powerful public-private partnerships could be, right? If we really work together. You talked about founders earlier, understanding the landscape, right? Like understanding what those stakeholder islands are. So what role can private sector play in shaping Florida's tech policy, and how can founders better engage with policymakers beyond, I guess, the whole go up to session?
If you're going up to session to introduce yourself, you're doing it all wrong, as you know. Right, like think about come see me in my district office in the off season.
That's right.
So understanding the timeline of government is important, where the budget cycles are, when session, how to back that up and go, okay, if I want to be relevant in the legislative session,
Mhm.
it's not going to be showing up during session. It's going to be backing that up to understand when legislative budget requests happen, how that happens, when to go meet with the members, when to go meet with the agencies, that kind of thing. So I think understanding that roadmap. And I think, to your point, like both the work you do in your own capacity, but also with the association is every minute I spend as a CEO working on budget forecasts and administrative stuff, I'm not spending on our productized services.
Yeah.
And every minute that a founder is having to spend to learn the legislature, they're
Mhm.
not focused on product market fit, product velocity, playing around and building.
Right.
So I think if we can build the right community of people, we give the ability for somebody to not have to know, right? The reason a CEO wants a CFO is so they no longer have to live in the forecast.
Right.
And what does it look like to kind of have a team? A good friend of mine recently said to me, I love the example because I would just throw a random number on it, but I think this visually makes a little more sense. Like 1 + 1 is either 2 or it's 11,
Wow.
right? It's either two ones next to each other, it's adding 1 + 1. And
Mhm.
I think that's the role that can be played is like, look, software co-founder, you are never going to understand Tallahassee the way Merdoshi does. Don't try, don't waste your time, focus on your product, understand definitions of success to go, all right, I think I got a thing. How do I go to somebody to let me know if this is a market that makes sense to penetrate?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what I would stress maybe to go back, because I want the invitation to radical disruption to be clear. There is an oligarchy. There is a good old boy network. It can be broken down, and I think it's happening. But it's going to take a collaborative effort
Yeah.
to help make that happen. And so maybe to sum on that, Merdoshi, is put everybody in the position to do what they do best. Nobody asked Shaq to play point guard, and there's a good reason. Find a
That's
point
such a
guard,
good point. That's such a
right?
good point.
Like find your teammates and put them in the position to do what they're best at and keep them out of the position of having to master or learn or struggle through what they're bad at.
No, that's awesome. I actually want to pivot a little bit to talent since you just talked about it. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at Ashton's wonderful face because she leads talent for the South Florida Tech Hub. So as we think about Tampa and Miami, right? Like you're Tampa born and bred. Well, I'm Miami born and bred. So as we think about those two incredible markets, emerging sort of as tech hotspots, I want to talk a little bit about talent, right? So in your experience, just doing what you do, is the state doing enough? Is Tampa doing enough? Is Miami doing enough to retain talent? Because that's been a question for a long time, and it's going to continue to be a question
Yeah.
for a long time.
That's a great question. So, and in fairness to Miami, Tampa does have an advantage on the recruiting trail in that we are the original home of the Cuban sandwich, but
You know,
y'all can overcome that. So I like the question, and I'm going to use Tallahassee as an example.
okay.
Tallahassee has everything on paper to be the next Austin.
Mm,
It has a top 20 research institution. It has a $115 billion enterprise called the State of Florida. It's a great location. It's on I-10 strategically in between the Panhandle and Jacksonville. The demographics of it are pretty similar to what the demographics were of Austin in the 70s and 80s. But for a number of reasons, Tallahassee can't get out of its own way. It's a very business unfriendly climate. There seems to be no strategic plan. And so when we were launching our business, I kind of thought at the time Tallahassee would be home. And I really kind of sold myself on it and got kind of excited to recruit businesses there. And at the end of the day, the 24-year-old until they're married with kids has nothing in Tallahassee.
wow.
So there is, even the companies that have a presence, like rent an office in an office tower, and it's like a couple of shared offices that are ghost towns, and it's just a place for people to fly in and visit. There's no foundation, there's no creation, there's no collaborative. It is a dearth for young professionals that want to have opportunity.
Mhm.
And I think the shame of that, my first kind of hire, a co-founder, Paige Spazzali, was our first digital scholar. We put an asterisk on it because we never got the program fully operationalized. But our premise was, Universities, give us your best talent. We'll give them real world application. We'll throw them right in the deep end. You just give them course credit. I'm not doing paperwork and book reports. I'm not a professor. I don't want to be anything bureaucratic, but I'll give them. And the reality is, when I looked with my own dollars and said, who do I want to hire? I wanted to hire a 23-year-old that showed me she was as hungry as anybody, would solve
Right.
problems and wasn't like stained by the status quo. And that's the way it's always been. And she validates that every day. She's a co-founder of the company with equity. Where's she going to get that in Tallahassee, and where's she going to get that in a large company?
Right.
So I think if you look at the elements of why Tallahassee's fundamentally challenged there, and then you look at markets like Tampa and Miami, I think Tampa and Miami are doing a really good job. I'm not going to subscribe to the enough. If great relationships require relentless pursuit of the other person, then we should never get complacent. I think there's ways we can do better. But I think it starts with giving people an environment where they want to live, where they want to work, and where they can see themselves raising a family, and they experience tremendous opportunity.
Yeah.
And so how do we bring those elements together?
No, that's yeah, you kind of solved for it. So it's 12:42. So maybe let's do two more questions or maybe one more question. Ashton, like let us know if there are questions because I haven't been monitoring the chat. But let us know.
We
Let's
have
see.
two. We have two. So I think if you do one or two
More
left, and then
questions, we'll have time. Okay.
also too, for those that on the call do have questions, start putting them in just if you haven't already done so. But yeah, Mardosha, you have time for one or two.
Awesome. All right, so let's end here, Jamie. So as a former legislator and state CIO, I feel like even though I tell you what's one piece of advice, you might have three. What are some words of wisdom?
I'll try and behave this time.
No, it's fine. What are some words of wisdom? I'll frame it that way. That you'd give tech founders looking to navigate our, policy advocacy in the state of Florida. Like at the end of the day, what do the folks on this call need to know in order to be successful?
If you'll allow me to reframe it a little bit, I think there's got to be a really acute need for a startup founder to engage in policy advocacy. I think if we reframed it to say, what is the one piece of advice if they want to go to market in the public sector?
Ooh, yep.
Because at the end of the day, what they care about is their P&L.
Yep.
Right? These startups do not have the resources to hire the lobbying firms, to do the research, to engage in it's just kind of a fait accompli. That said, I'm wildly bullish on the next 10 to 15 years of SaaS in the public sector for a few reasons.
Ooh.
Number one, government has no ability to buy, design, scope, implement, and manage SaaS.
Yeah.
What government has done historically is pay for custom development or hire staff aug to build stuff. We still have plenty of stuff in COBOL. So if I was a startup founder, I would either go the route I'm describing now, or I would go learn COBOL.
Yeah.
And so they're going to need access to solutions. Two, what AI is doing that I think in front of us, all of us are, I'd say I'm already on to two. Two, what AI is doing in front of us. If I'm a SaaS company right now, everybody knows Slack was a cousin company of ours. We were using Slack in 2014. I'm a fanboy, use it everywhere, love it. But if I'm Slack, I'm looking at my business saying my threat is not Teams. My threat is my customer building their own Slack.
Right.
So I think as government figures out, it's got to change radically. Like it needs new people, new leadership, new process, new appropriate, like all of it. And as the grift around the big SI game kind of gets exposed, and we realize that we're paying 10, 15 times what we could pay for a solution, and if we're spending 2 to 5 times longer to get that solution, then things are going to change. So if I'm a co-founder and I look at it and go, all right, I want to do business with the public sector. The piece of advice goes back to those islands. And it says, I need to understand those islands. I need to map out what that looks like. I'm happy, if we want to do like even a session to break those down, I'll do these as regularly.
You're coming back, Jamie. We talked about that before this started. You're coming.
As long as you can put up with me, I'll come hang out with y'all. But really to break down those islands and say, here's what they are. Here's what the incentive structures are. And then maybe pragmatically understand that if you're good at marketing and messaging to the private sector, Take
Yeah.
every bit of that messaging and invert it 180 degrees. And now you have great public sector marketing.
Wow.
It is a mutually inverted process because in the private sector, the rule is innovate or die. In the public sector is innovate and you may get killed. So understanding how to do that is critical.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. All right, Ashton, it is 12:47. I assume we have some questions, which I'm sure Jamie's happy to take, especially since he said, you
All
know,
questions are on the table.
all
No.
questions are on the table.
No filters. Let's go.
Well, this is wonderful, and thank you so much for your insight, and Murdoshi also too for just facilitating and coordinating and making this such a great conversation. So the first is actually, it seems like more like a little bit of a clarification. It says Florida government is made up of decentralized stakeholder islands, each of which should be viewed as their own legislative business verticals. The legislators should be viewed as a board of directors. And then the second is data governance. Data quality should have the same level of importance as water quality. From what I gather, because of the different islands, data cannot be well utilized and therefore AI will be impossible to leverage. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty well summed up, David. So thank you. I think if we took the two things together, it's not so much that the board of director, that the island should be different verticals. It's that they're different stakeholders in the same ecosystem. So like if I think there's 12 primary ones, 10 to 12, depending on how you break them down. But those 10 to 12 islands are all part of like a union. Think about how America was created, a federation of states creating a federal government. If those islands are like different states, they all have to engage in commerce together. And if one of them is off, the commerce can break down.
Yeah.
So it's not verticals, it's very diagonal, maybe to think of it that way. And it's not necessarily even sequential or hierarchical. Each opportunity, each deal presents itself like this little it's like whack-a-mole, where like this stakeholder like pops up as an obstructionist, and you're like, okay, what do I do? Well, if I can translate their incentive structures and what they're, I can handle that and keep moving. And then on the second, I think what I would say is the reason I make the water quality, and it's a great follow-up, David. The reason I make the water quality parallel is not even as granular as AI. It's to say that data travels across jurisdictions. The Russians and the Chinese do not care about the difference between Lee County and the state of Florida, or the city of Tallahassee and the Agency for Healthcare Administration. And yet, your state agencies are interacting with local governments through different applications, network access. Think of all the ways that that connectivity happens. And so, if we think about it strictly from a jurisdictional perspective, we are creating massive vulnerabilities because the application, the agency, or the organization adjacent to me, if compromised, directly compromises me. So I don't have the ability to say, I have a great alarm system at my house. I have 24/7 security at my house. I'm safe if my neighbor is doing reckless things and allowing the threat actor to live next door.
All
Thanks,
right.
David.
And I'm going to continue on with David's second comment, and it's along the same lines of these structural questions, which is good, I think, to go into more in depth. So he says, just trying to understand the characters in the Kabuki theater. You have a group in government that suffers from term limits, and you have a group of the good old boys that I assume are businessmen in Florida with most of the money. Is there a group of people in Florida government that the good old boys latch onto who don't suffer from term limits? And then he further goes on to say that $500 million that was wasted, how many of years of waste does that represent, or is that every year?
Yeah, so great question. And probably a great opportunity, David. So thank you for the question to clarify kind of maybe the traditional context of good old boys and what I mean here. What I would say here, and there's a company that I'm a big fan of, Pursuit.us, if anybody wants to check them out, and they're looking on how to go outbound more effectively. They're doing some really cool stuff as an AI platform, but their CEO has become a good friend, and we spend a lot of time on this. He had no public sector experience, so he's coming in with questions all the time, like how does this work, whatnot. And one of their kind of tagline is goodbye relationships, hello opportunity. And I think if I was to say that there's this systemic thing in government that's broken, it's that relationships lead. And I'm a big fan of relationships. People that know me know I have a very close tribe they can call in the middle of the night and tell me they need whatever. Like, I'm big on relationship. But in this context, I mean that people broker relationships and the commodity is the relationship. So it's not actually relationship. It's a perverse use of the word relationship because it's really just a transactional use of somebody.
Yeah.
So the number of people that made tens of millions of dollars off my back in the last 15 years that no longer return a phone call or reach out is not, I mean, it's huge. All that tells me is there was no relationship. I was just the pony they could ride and win the race. So the good old boy network that I'm describing, David, is very much just brokering access. And that network of people don't want you to understand who you need to talk to, how you need to talk to, because their only real value is having a access point to make an introduction, which I would argue is in fact no relationship. They're just trading on that. Opportunity on the other end looks very different. So that's how I would kind of describe that. It's not so much like big money or good. I mean, there's large money behind it, but you have companies, you have lobbyists, you have people that do it kind of the closed broker way. And then you have people that are trying to say, what if we created a marketplace to compete and we just want an opportunity to compete? We don't want a guaranteed win. And that army is growing, David, of people that say, look, we're just trying to say the government should have access to transparent priced solutions in the marketplace that bring the buyer and the seller closer together. Understanding how contract vehicles work, maybe is one call out there. Man, that is one way that people have been kept out for a long time. And there's a lot of good stuff happening on that front to create on-ramps to contract vehicles and try and kind of break down what that brokered access network has been doing for a long time to say, sorry, you're not eligible because you're not on a contract vehicle and that contract vehicle is not going to be up for another 5 years. It's offensive. And then the second question you asked was the $500 million. So that was a subset of just large projects defined as $10 million or more from 2005 to 2020. I don't know that anybody has pulled that study. I think I would hammer the over on whether or not there has been more money wasted than that in the last 5 years. I would hammer the over, and I would bet a mortgage payment on it, because it just keeps happening in this just disgusting model where there's no accountability from the front end. And you can look at these projects. One of our roles at the Digital Services Project Oversight, we would look at the procurement and we're like, that thing's set for failure. Like, we could save all the money. We can predict how this is going. And every single one of them, I mean, the stuff that's going to get uncovered with transparency is it's gross and capital G gross. And so that's where I think like some of the work to understand how procurements work, the tactics that are used, translating what those things are. It's why I mentioned the Florida procurements work. I think it's floridaprocurements.com. I see Sean's with us. If Sean wants to throw the link to the site in there, Murdoshi, if you don't care, he's just got a blog where he's open sourcing stuff going, hey guys, this is what this means and this is what that means. So I think that's maybe where I'd land, and I'll hop on Matt's question because it is game day, and the greatest basketball team in the galaxy, coming from the Harvard of the South, also known as Auburn, Alabama. I cannot bet against my boys. So I am highly optimistic that the best team in America cuts the Nets down this year.
It's a good thing we have a short amount of time left to argue who's the Harvard of the South on this call, but
Self-proclaimed.
but we do have one quick
Look, I know it's not Ashton. I know it's not in Tuscaloosa. I think we can agree on that.
Deal. Totally deal. But we have one small question and then I'm going to hand it back to Murdoshi. So for small businesses, and I think it's a short one, for small businesses, is it worth it to try to sell to the Florida government?
With a process, yes. So start at the distribution or contract vehicle access point, be eligible. And that might be a good thing for us to spend some time in some of the follow-ups we've talked about to really kind of educate folks. If you're showing up to sell and you haven't answered the question of, I would ask this question all the time as a CIO when I saw something that fit a need that I was intrigued by. I would ask, what's the easiest way to acquire your solution? And if they said RFP, I was out. And one of the reasons that the 3 years for me was so hellacious was As soon as the state's chief procurement officer at the time, Roz Ingram, said to me, explained to me the difference between a purchase and a procurement. And she was the president at the time of the National Association of State Procurement Officers, NASPO. When she laid that out for me, I was like, what kind of masochist or sadistic person do you have to be to RFP if I can go get everything I need off of a number of different contract vehicles? So we spent probably, I don't know that I have a full accounting because a lot of it was through the Emergency Operations Center, but I think we probably spent $350 million in my 3 years, and I ran 0 procurements. That made a lot of enemies, right? That oligarchy that we're talking about really didn't like that, because it cut them out of the way. And so, when you have a lobbyist go into the governor's office and say, Jamie's violating procurement law, now I have to spend a month, rather than building and managing, explaining to some 30-something in the governor's office that was a comms director what procurement law actually says, what NASPO is, what a cooperative purchasing agreement is, instead of doing my job. And so that army came after me pretty hard. But we were able to show that it works. And so, yes, they should absolutely have public sector on their roadmap. But if they're just showing up to try and sell and they haven't been positioned to sell, they're going to waste their time, waste their money. And I wouldn't recommend doing that. So done right, they should absolutely be at the table during this bullish hockey stick of SaaS access to government.
Beautiful. And I'm going to hand it back over to Murdoshi. But for those that see the events in the chat, we have upcoming events for Tech Hub. And so we have Tech Talent Fest, which is a month away. It's essentially a career fair on steroids, so traditional aspect. And then we have panels, workshops, all the good things. Next week, we are the only tech partner of the Miami Open. So Miami Open Serve and Network Tech Night. That is going to be on the 20th, and then Dev Dive and all sorts of stuff there too. You can see all of the full information on our website, but I'm going to hand it back over to Murdoshi for your question and to round us out. And also, Jamie, thank you so much. This was wonderful. So Murdoshi.
Thank you. So before I sort of give Jamie my last question, please follow him on socials, guys. He's on LinkedIn. I mean, Jamie's not hard to find. Just follow him because he's just a world of knowledge. And of course, he's going to come back to talk about stakeholder islands and do a whole lot of other stuff with us. But Jamie, so if you and I are having this conversation 5 years from now, provided, Ashton and I fly to South Carolina, and so we're with you in studio pod session. 5 years from now, what will you hope have changed in the state of Florida?
I think truth and transparency. I think that there is just, with a lack of truth and a lack of transparency, kind of like regulation, right? When you take an approach to regulation, you can write it in a way that punishes everybody to prevent the bad, or you can write it in a way that empowers the innovator and the good without putting a ceiling on them, but then has clear accountability for the bad. And I think in a murky environment where people don't understand the languages, it does a few things. It's the grossest and most perverse structure because it makes it almost impossible for the young company that has a real solution that could cut cost and it makes it impossible for them to get into the ecosystem.
Yeah.
While simultaneously protecting the existing grifts and empowering the frauds that don't have to be held accountable. And I think, when we staff is a great example. I hate labels because I think they're lazy and sloppy. And so it would be lazy and sloppy for me to say that if you're in this category, if you're a trial lawyer, you're good. If you're insurance, you're bad. And the legislature does that all the time, or the opposite. There are plenty of talented, driven, mission-driven, passionate people that want to actually transform government, and they're being kept out. Then there's kind of the people that are there just for their title, their status, their power, and they can coast. And then there's actually liars and frauds, and all of those things exist. And so I think if we could look back in 5 years and we let truth and transparency win, it would eradicate the liars and frauds for what they are. It would compel those folks in the middle to go left or right. Like they would either go towards the success side or they would go towards the dinosaur side. But I think truth and transparency is a pathway for Florida to own the next 100 years of public sector innovation because of those assets we talked about at the beginning that no other state has. A super friendly business climate that continues to accelerate, a place that people want to live and work and raise a family and start a business, and simultaneously embracing the talent pipeline of the top the top higher ed university system in the country, right? We have all the tools. If we can bring it together and translate truth and elevate transparency, I think we win the future.
Awesome. Well, for those of you who stayed on, thank you so much. We're only a minute over, but thank you so much for joining Jamie and myself in the South Florida Tech Hub. Like I said, please follow him on socials. He's absolutely amazing. And we look forward to having him to come back, and have a great afternoon and weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
And the
guys.
links for socials are in the chat, so grab them.
You're awesome, Ashton. Thank you so much. Jamie, thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully it's what you wanted.